How does a stall of economic activity in China impact the United States? How do things like the interest rate lead to a change in consumer spending behavior? How exactly do economists determine what will happen in a short run versus long run economic scenario? Well, all of those questions will be answered for you in this week's review on national income and price determination. Lego. How's it going, my friends? Welcome back for our Unit 3 review on national income and price determination. So Unit 3 is going to be one of the most important units in AP Macro. It's going to contain a lot of information. So as always, remember, this is just to serve you as a review. You should not rely solely on these videos for all of your studying. When there's something in this video that I talk about that you don't understand or you might be a little confused, take out your textbook, take out your notes, go to the PowerPoints in Google Classrooms, use those review sheets. As always, feel free to email me. I will help you, but do not just stay confused because you will not learn anything. I will always try and get back to you as soon as possible. And plus, sometimes I leave a nice little message in there to make you feel better about yourself. You have a lot of options and a wide variety of resources at your disposal, so please use them. Anyways, on to the review. We are going to start off Unit 3 talking aggregate demand and how the demand of all goods and services are measured in an economy. From there, we'll talk aggregate supply in both the short and long run and the relationship between the economy in the short run and the long run. From there, we're going to move on to macroeconomic equilibrium. This is where we're going to take our aggregate demand and both of our aggregate supply curves and plot them all onto one model. And our last topic of discussion for this unit will be fiscal policy and the multiplier effect. We're going to take a look at how exactly can government intervention affect an economy. This unit focuses all on aggregate. So aggregates is a big word, but this is a good thing because in economic terms, all it means is the total of all economic activity. This unit is going to contain one of the most important graphs for the class. This is going to be our ADAS model, or our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. When we graph aggregate demand or aggregate supply, we're going to see that our y-axis is going to contain price level. So what price level is just going to be the average or current prices across an entire spectrum of goods and services produced in the economy, while our x-axis is going to be where output or real GDP is shown. In simple terms, aggregate demand is just going to be the demand for goods and services in the entire macro economy. What exactly is included in aggregate demand? Well, this is an easy question to answer because in Unit 2, I introduced you to a very important formula and stated that this might be one of the most important formulas in the entire class. If you guessed the formula to calculate gross domestic product, you are spot on, my friend. To determine what is included in aggregate demand, we just look at the components of the expenditure approach of GDP. We're going to take a look at consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. All four of those things are going to have an impact on whether our aggregate demand shifts left or shifts right. So if you know the contents of GDP, you know the contents of aggregate demand. The aggregate demand curve is going to be downward sloping, and it's going to show the relationship between the aggregate price level and the quantity of aggregate output demanded. As I just mentioned, when plotted on a graph, aggregate demand is downward sloping. Why exactly is that? Well, we're going to have three reasons. First, we have the wealth effect. The wealth effect basically states that a change in the aggregate price level is the change in consumer spending caused by altered purchasing power of consumers' assets. A lot of big words there. What exactly did I just say? Well, the wealth effect basically states that an increase in price level, all other things equal, is going to result in a decrease in purchasing power. Let's put this in an example. Everyone say hi to Bill. Bill has $5,000 saved up and he does not touch it for a year. All other things equal, so not accounting for things like interest, if our aggregate price were to rise 25%, Bill's $5,000 would now have the purchasing power that $4,000 would have prior to this increase in price level. So what exactly is Bill going to do? Well, he might stop spending his money since now that it's worth less, and he might wait for a time to spend it when his purchasing power is is a little stronger. The thing is, Bill is not going to be alone here. Thousands of other people will respond in the exact same way, leading to a decrease in consumer spending. It makes sense. At a higher price level, all the goods and services are going to be more expensive. It makes sense not to spend as much of our money during these times because we are not getting the best bang for our buck. The opposite is going to occur when price level decreases. People will spend more since they have a higher purchasing power. The interest rate effect is going to be that a change in price level will be a change in investment and consumer spending. This will be caused by altered interest rates that are a result from changes in the demand for money. When the price level rises, real interest rates rise. This is because when the price level rises, more people want to hold on to money due to its higher purchasing power. This leads to more borrowing, and we see a demand for loans increase. When the demand for loans increases, the real interest rate increases as well. The exchange rate effect is going to be the change in net exports caused by a change in the values of a nation's currency. This leads to a relative change in price of domestic and foreign goods and services. Let's say, for example, the US price level rises. Well, what exactly is going to happen? All other things equal, with the prices in other countries remaining the same, a rise in US price level is going to make US produced goods and services more expensive relative to foreign made goods. This is going to cause foreign countries to stop importing goods and services to the US, and it also might cause US citizens to import goods and services from another country at a lower cost. Just like aggregate demand is going to have movement along the curve as well as shifters. We just explained why there is movement along the curve. Now we're going to talk about what causes the aggregate demand curve to shift. This is going to be fairly easy. As I mentioned earlier, the components of aggregate demand are the same components of GDP. So this is going to be consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. Anything that will affect any of these components of aggregate demand will lead to a shift in aggregate demand. Let's take a look at an example. What would happen if business owners are less optimistic about the state of the economy? Instead of investing in capital goods, firms will hold on to their money. This is going to be a decrease of investment spending. As a result, we are going to see aggregate demand shift from the left from AD to AD2. Another example, the government decides that they're going to lower personal income tax. With more money in consumers' pockets, they now have more of a disposable income. This is going to be an increase in consumer expenditure. This shifts our aggregate demand curve to the right from AD to AD2. You now see that we have a higher level of output at a higher price level. Next up, we have aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is going to be the total amount of goods and services that firms are going to produce in an economy at different price levels. The total amount of goods and services is going to be equal to real GDP. Aggregate supply is going to differentiate between aggregate supply in the short run versus aggregate supply in the long run. Our short run aggregate supply curve, or SRAS for short, is going to show how our economy is being affected in the short term, while long run aggregate supply, or LRAS, is going to show how an event affects our economy over time. Seems pretty obvious, right? The reason we have to differentiate supply in the short run and the long run is because in the short run, wages and resource prices are considered sticky. This simply means that wages, so the salary someone makes, is going to lag behind economic activity. Let's say the demand for and sales of products are very strong with rising output prices. Firms are going to have to hire more workers to meet this new demand for all of these goods. In the short run, we will not see an increase in wages, and this is because employers are going to be reluctant to immediately raise nominal wages with some employees. Generally speaking, people work under salary or an hourly contract, so there is no requirement for employers to give a raise. However, in the long run, competition for good workers is going to increase. This is going to allow for nominal wages to increase as well. Just like aggregate demand, aggregate supply will also have its shifter. In the short run, we have 4 shifters of aggregate supply. These are going to be changes in resource prices, inflationary expectations, changes in productivity, and government action. In the 1970s, the United States economy faced a huge issue. OPEC, which is one of the largest producers of oil in the Middle East, issued an oil embargo on all countries they believed were supporting Israel. Towards the end of the embargo, the price of oil in the United States increased by nearly 400%. This is going to cause our short-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the left, which is going to cause an increase in price level. This leads to inflation. We also now see a decrease in output. Our economy is not going to function at our potential GDP. This is what is known as a negative supply shock, and it's going going to lead to something called stagflation. This is when we are in a stagnant or a slow economy, but we're seeing a rising price level or inflation. This is one of the worst places an economy can be in. If inflation is expected, workers might start to demand a cost of living adjustment in order to keep a steady amount of purchasing power. When contracts expire, workers generally receive their COLA, bringing us back to what we are going to learn to be macroeconomic equilibrium. If workers can be more productive and produce more units of output with the similar amount of input, what is going to happen to our economy? Generally, these are going to be technological advancements that allow different tasks to be completed at a quicker rate. So like I just mentioned, we are now producing more, but at the same input. This is what is known as a positive supply shock. It's when we see a decrease in price level, but higher output. Situations such as these help lead to solid economic growth. And lastly, we have government action. So it's important to note here that the government action on the supply side of things does not include government spending, because remember, government spending is strictly going to be an aggregate demand shifter. These are just going to include things such as taxes, subsidies, or different regulations. If the government places more taxes on businesses or firms, it's going to lead to less disposable income for those businesses and firms, which can lead to a decrease in supply produced. This leads to a shift of our short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. Now we're going to focus on our long-run aggregate supply curve. As you can see, this curve is a vertical line. As mentioned earlier, wages and resource prices are generally considered sticky. They will not increase in the short run, but they will increase and catch up in the long run. If wages increased automatically with price level, we would see an increased price level, but not an increase in output. Firms may be making more, but those profits are going to go to new employee wages. We will talk about shifters of long-run aggregate supply a little later, but just know now that long-run aggregate supply is going to measure our potential output. So when we're on our long-run aggregate supply curve, we are functioning at full employment. Now what we're going to do is take aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply, and we are going to see what happens to make macroeconomic equilibrium. Macroeconomic equilibrium is just going to refer to when the quantity of real GDP demanded equals the quantity of real GDP supplied. At macroeconomic equilibrium, the economy can be at three different places. We can be at full employment equilibrium. This is when our equilibrium of real GDP equals our long-run aggregate supply. So basically this means that our aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply all intersect at one point on the graph. We then have above full employment equilibrium. This is when our equilibrium real GDP is going to exceed our long-run aggregate supply, as shown here. And last, we have below full employment, where our equilibrium real GDP is going to be less than our long-run aggregate supply or potential GDP. I want to take a quick second to show how our ADAS model relates to both the business cycle and the production's possibilities curve. At point A on all three of our graphs, we can see an economy at full employment equilibrium. Our PPC we have producing on our potential output line. Our business cycle is also right on potential output. For our ADAS model, we are going to show full employment equilibrium as all of our curves are going to intersect at one point on the graph. So let's take a look at our business cycle. What has to happen next? Well, our business cycle shows that we are going down into a recessionary gap. From our last review, we know that when we're in a recessionary gap, we are producing inside of the production's possibilities curve. Point B on our graph is going to show us below full employment. On our ADAS model, you can see that we are operating in a recessionary gap. Both output and price level are low and decreasing. Looking at our y-axis, you can see that our price level has decreased, and our x-axis shows that our output has also decreased. The definition of a recessionary gap. Going back to the business cycle, what has to happen? Well, eventually our output is going to start to increase as we head into an expansionary gap. On our production's possibilities curve, we are temporarily producing outside of our potential GDP, closer to that 0% unattainable production possibility curve that we saw last unit. On our ADAS model, you can now see that we are above full employment equilibrium, where our output is going to be increasing along with our price level. Now let's focus solely on our ADAS model for a second. When looking at this model, one of four things can change that leads to a shift in a curve. An increase in aggregate demand will cause the aggregate demand curve to shift right. This is going to lead to an increase in price level as as well as an increase in output. So our real GDP is increasing. We can also see a decrease in aggregate demand. This is going to cause a leftward shift to aggregate demand. As mentioned earlier, when this happens, we see a decrease in price level along with a decrease in output. Now things start to get interesting when we see supply shocks occur. We can have both a positive or a negative supply shock. These are going to be shifters of our short-run aggregate supply curve. When we see an increase in aggregate supply, you're going to see our price level decrease and our output increase. This is the sign of a growing economy. This is a good place for our economy to be in. On the other side, if you see a decrease in aggregate supply, this is going to lead to a stagnant economy with higher price level. Now I want to take a quick look at how we differentiate what will happen in the long run versus what will happen in the short run. When looking at different AP questions, it is very, very important to carefully read over the question. Sometimes they might ask what is going to happen in the long run. Sometimes they might ask what will happen in the short run, so you want to make sure you're answering the proper question. When we are in an inflationary gap, in the long run, wages and resources will eventually catch up and increase in price. Remember, wages are sticky, but in the long run they can adjust. In a recessionary gap, wages and resource prices will eventually decrease. What does this look like on our model? Well, let's take a look at an example. Here we have our ADAS graph showing a full employment equilibrium. We have two questions here. Question one says, suppose that household wealth has been falling for several months. Given this, what changes in the ADAS graph will we see in the short run? Well, let's walk through this problem. If household wealth is falling, consumers have less disposable income. If consumers have less disposable income, what exactly has to happen? Well, they're going to end up saving their money for essential items or saving their money for when they have more purchasing power. We see a drop in consumer spending, which means our aggregate demand curve is going to shift left from AD to AD2, putting us below full employment equilibrium. You can now see that our ADAS graph, our real GDP is falling as a result of less consumer spending. This also leads to a decrease in price level. So now that we worked out what will happen in the short run, we have to move to question 2, which asks us to explain what will happen in the long run. Think back to the business cycle. Currently we are in a recessionary gap. So what has to happen next? We will eventually get back to full employment equilibrium. How exactly is this shown on our ADAS graph? Remember, wages are sticky in the short run but adjust in the long run. As wages eventually decrease and individuals take pay cuts, firms end up paying less in wages, so they have more money to increase their supply. This is going to cause a rightward shift in our short-run aggregate supply curve. This brings us back to full employment equilibrium. And for our last topic of discussion, we have fiscal policy and the multiplier effect. There are going to be two entities involved in stabilizing the economy. This is going to be the federal government and the country's central banking system. In the US, our central banking system is referred to as the Federal Reserve Bank. Any action made by the Federal Reserve in an attempt to stabilize the economy is known as monetary policy. We're not going to focus so much on monetary policy in this unit because it's a big part of Unit 4, the financial sector. For now, we're just going to take a look at government intervention with fiscal policy. The government can either spend money or issue taxes in order to fix a failing economy or deal with unexpected inflation. Fiscal policy can be either discretionary or non-discretionary. We're going to see that discretionary fiscal policy is when Congress creates a new law that is designed to shift our aggregate demand through government spending or taxation. Non-discretionary fiscal policy is going to be known as an automatic stabilizer. These are permanent spending or tax laws that are put into place to work counter-cyclically to the business cycle in order to keep the economy as close to potential GDP as possible. This helps us deal with unanticipated inflation or deflation. Non-discretionary fiscal policy is seen in things like unemployment laws or minimum wage. Fiscal policy can also be contractionary or expansionary. Expansionary fiscal policy is going to be the gas pedal of the economy. This is going to be when the government is trying to stimulate a stagnant economy, while contractionary fiscal policy is going to be considered the brakes. These laws are designed to slow down an economy that is experiencing unanticipated inflation. Next, we are going to look at how government spending can help stimulate the economy by learning about the multiplier effect. The multiplier effect is a very important concept in macroeconomics. There is a spending multiplier for fiscal policy and a money multiplier for monetary policy. The formulas are going to be very similar, but they are measuring two different things. For this unit, we are going to focus on the spending multiplier. When the government goes out and spends money, this money becomes another person's income. Well, what exactly are they going to do with that money? Well, what do you do when you get money? You save some of it and spend the rest. Those are really our only only two options with money. When we receive money, we can put some away and save it, or we can spend it on something. Well, when that money's spent, that is going to become another person's income. So that person's going to save a little bit and spend the rest. It becomes another person's income, and this just keeps on going on and on and on. What we are going to see is that an initial change in spending is going to cause a ripple effect for the entire economy, and this leads to more total spending in general. To calculate the spending multiplier, you have to understand two concepts: the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save. The marginal propensity to consume basically states that the more disposable income an individual has, the more they will spend, while the marginal propensity to save is just going to be the fraction of an increase in income that is saved rather than spent. Now, this concept is fairly simple to understand. If I were to give you $100 and you spend $75 and save $25, your marginal propensity to save would be 0.25, while your marginal propensity to consume would be 0.75. Together, they will always equal 1. Like I said, you can either spend it or save it. So now on to the formula for the spending multiplier. The spending multiplier equals 1 over top of our marginal propensity to save. So let's take a look at an example. Let's say our marginal propensity to consume is 0.5. Simple, right? That just makes our marginal propensity to save also 0.5. Remember, they always have to equal 1. So we simply plug this into the equation. We do 1 over 0.5, and this gives us a spending multiplier of 2. Now, I want you to remember that number because we're going to come back to it. But first, we're going to go look at another example. Now I want you to assume that our marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. So if 0.8 is our marginal propensity to consume, what is going to be our marginal propensity to save? It's going to be 0.2. So we solve for our formula and do 1 over our marginal propensity to save, which would be 0.2, and we get a spending multiplier of 5. What does this mean exactly? Well, let's say the government increases spending by $1 billion. In our first scenario, we see an increase in spending of $2 billion. We simply multiply the spending multiplier by the amount of government spending. For our second example, we would see an increase of spending of $5 billion. For the AP test, you always want to assume that the marginal propensity to spend and save are going to be the same for an entire economy. And that's about it for our Unit 3 review video. Thank you for tuning in. Now on to the weekly FRQ. Remember to submit that bad boy right there to Google Classrooms under the appropriate link. I will obviously still accept it if you send it to me by email, but I will like you a little less. On that note, on to the bunker. Deuces.